Tonight's topic is Taoist masters. There's a picture of one that I met personally in 1995 in the cave of the Heavenly Master on Mount Qingcheng. What's that?
What year?
1993. He was said to be, well, he was, I take their word for it, it looks 93 to me. He came back, I took this picture of him, it was better, this is like, long story, but someplace in this house somewhere there's the original slide that's much better, but still, I think it kind of captured him, and he definitely looks 93. And this particular monastery is where Taoism originated in China. It was on Mount Qingcheng in Sichuan. Of course, it spread then all over China, and Sichuan is a province, so it's not necessarily where Taoism is centered anymore, but the fact is it's still a very important monastery. And this guy was their oldest living ritual master. To my knowledge, and I think, we asked, and I think they just told us, he didn't know any Kung Fu of any kind. He was a ritual master. He basically was ceremonial. He knew all the ancient rituals. And in fact, I didn't see much Kung Fu in any Taoist monastery we visited. The Taoists in Taoist monasteries are mostly practicing what appeared to me to be a religion. Kind of interesting religion, but I didn't see that it was particularly esoteric or profound. Now this guy at 93 seemed really cheerful, which that's something. Particularly, born in China in 1900 or so, going through, a century really of revolutions and war to come out this cheerful. I think that says something.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Taoist master who supposedly taught Wong was said to be like that also, all the time laughing, all the time smiling, all the time in a good mood, not at all kind of remote and serious and holy, seeming much more natural and kind of having fun. So I'm going to jump back to the beginning of Taoist masters for me. Are any of you familiar with this?
Oh yeah, that was I was obsessed with that trilogy.
Yes, this was how Taoism in its fantasy form came into America in 1993. I was out of the Rajneesh monastery, was done with Indians. I was learning Tai Chi, and these books came out. And they were like the Castaneda books were in the 60s. These were the coolest thing in the New Age world in the 80s.
Are they novels or?
That's the question.
Oh, it's like.
That's why I referenced the Castaneda books. I personally think they were modeled along the same lines as the Castaneda books. And now, of course, at the time you couldn't tell. Are these, there's so many elements in them that are obviously fantasy. I compared it to like Meetings with Remarkable Men. Sort of a blend between parable and real history, and you can't tell and are not supposed to be able to tell, and it doesn't matter which is which. You shouldn't be too focused on absolute literal truth or some such thing like that. But there were so many things in it that purely were not credible. But still, that was always a question for me: is it true? Is it not true? Now, you go to the author's note. I had heard through two friends of a 65-year-old martial arts teacher known only as Mr. Guan. They asked me if I had ever heard of him. I had not, but they were then searching for a teacher, and I accompanied them to visit his class. I had been involved in Chinese martial arts for 5 years and went to see if he was a genuine teacher. We arrived early at the secluded park where he taught. The training area was empty. We went to another section to practice while we waited and had become deeply engaged in Tai Chi pushing hands when a rather large man appeared in the bushes. He looked about 30 years old and had a medium-long black hair and enormously heavy shoulders. Dressed in a gray sweatshirt and brown warm-up suit, he stood completely motionless and stared unabashedly at us. I was annoyed. He looked like a college student, a jock out to provoke people. If he were a student at Mr. Guan's, why didn't he go and wait respectively for his master instead of looking about? Well, of course, this is Mr. Guan. So then the class starts and he comes in and starts leading it, and afterwards they talk. And he explained his martial background, in which he had studied with virtually every famous martial arts teacher that to come out of China, all of whom were now dead. I mean, he was 65. He looked 30, but he was 65. His martial background attracted me. Most present-day masters have studied only with students of these famous teachers. And yet here was a man who represented the first generation taught by those masters. Eager to study with him, I inquired about the tuition. Mr. Guan looked visibly embarrassed. Money matters seemed to make him uncomfortable. He hesitantly told me that it was $35 a month. There was a pause. He added that for this sum a student could train with him 4 or 5 times a week if desired. There was another pause. As if he felt the cost was still insufficiently justified, he went on to explain what the money was to be used for. Out of the $35, only $10 went to sustain himself. Another $10 was set aside for the future building of a school, and the remaining $15 was sent back to China to support his master. I asked which master it was. All the masters he had named had passed away, and I tried to imagine what kind of a master this man could have. My Taoist master, replied Mr. Guan. Your Taoist master? I was excited. I had originally entered martial arts in the hopes of finding a man such as Mr. Guan. It was said that the spiritual could be reached through the martial training, and while I had trained in Sichuan with several successive teachers, I had never found anyone who might have instructed me fully. I was still searching for a master who could teach me both martial arts and philosophy. He must be very old, I said, trying to keep the subject going. Mr. Guan was quiet, reluctant to discuss his master. He is, Mr. Guan said after a moment of decision. He has long white hair and a beard and is now 142 years old. He spends his time in meditation. 142? Is that possible? Of course. He is a Taoist. And you? Well, I am a Taoist ascetic. In fact, I only teach martial arts as a sideline. We talked for a while more until Mr. Guan had to leave. I returned to visit his class several times and soon became his student. I was as interested in the rare and unorthodox martial arts he taught as in his Taoism. I liked being his student and addressed him as Shifu. He's 65 in 1980, let's say, because the book came out in 1983. So 65 in 1980, that means he was born in the 20s, right? So this book is basically the stories Guan Caihong told his students as he was teaching them Kung Fu. And the book starts with the Taishan Festival. In 1929, Guan Caihong accompanied his family on a pilgrimage up the steep slopes of Taishan. They were traveling to the Emerald Cloud Temple at the mountain summit for the Festival of the Jade Emperor, a religious event that combined weeks of ritual and devotion with a carnival-like atmosphere in the temple courtyard. The Guan family, members of an immensely wealthy warrior clan, were devout patrons of Taoism who were completing a long and arduous pilgrimage of over 500 miles from their home in Shaanxi province to Shandong province. They would be guests of the temple for a month. The final ascent of Taishan by means of sedan chairs was slow. Taishan's towering precipices could not be scaled in a day, but the gradual climb, divided by overnight lodging in rustic inns situated in pine groves, provided an opportunity for final ablutions. All the inns served only vegetarian foods, and the cleansing of the taint of animal flesh and the opportunity for contemplation quieted the pilgrims' minds. When Sai Hung was introduced to the abbot, he's a child like about South Park age, basically. When Sai Hung was introduced to the abbot, he dutifully gave his greetings, bowing deeply. But after he saw that the adults had turned to conversation, he slipped through the temple gates. The temple courtyard burst with a frenzy of activity in a setting of bright colors. Against the background of the temple's bronze-tiled roofs, polychromed eaves, ridge poles, and worn red brick walls, thousands of hand-painted silk lanterns, pinwheels, and tiny bells swung above stalls, stages, and crowds of people. Musicians, acrobats, puppeteers, magicians, and muscle men were performing throughout the courtyard. Priests, dressed in patched gray robes, strolled among the people selling incense, talismans, and votive objects. Some gave advice while others predicted people's fortunes. But the best of all to Sai Hung were the many food stands offering fresh, steaming vegetarian food and delightfully sweet candy. Eating for Sai Hung was even more wonderful than getting into mischief, and he had a great appetite for both. Although he wanted to explore the entire festival, he could hardly refuse the temptation of fragrant food. He bought many different kinds of candies, some of which he ate on the spot, saving the others in his pockets. Only after he had found his favorite, miniature apples skewered and dipped in honey, did he go the rest of the festival. He squeezed his way through a dense forest of trousers and skirts to the center of the courtyard. On a high platform was a group of darkly dressed musicians, performing from a large repertoire of operas, popular songs, and classical works. They had a good range of instruments, including the lute, harp, violin, flute, and other reed instruments, and an arsenal of gongs, cymbals, and percussion instruments. Armed with this mighty array, the musicians were wholly unconcerned with the already roaring din of the festival. They played loudly and shrilly, finishing off each section of a song with wildly crashing cymbals and gongs to make themselves heard. Whenever another group was ready to perform on another stage, its figures would cry out loudly like carnival hawkers, promising great entertainment and unimaginable feats. Sai Hung was attracted by the announcement of a magician. Come, 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 uncles and aunties, sisters and brothers, elders and children, come, 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 see amazing things, magic to make the gods jealous, magic that will leave you incredulous. Come, come. So then there's the magician, and then there's the strong man who picked up an iron bar, twisted it and straightened it. In the days that followed, Sai Hung had time to explore the rest of the festival under his aunt's supervision. The temple became playground, theater, and restaurant for him and provided endless diversions. He met other children and became friends with them. Together, he and his new companions made up games, snacked, or looked at the many performances. But the Taishan festival was, after all, a religious event. Concurrent with all the festivities were daily rituals. The most important ritual was the dance of the Big Dipper. This ceremony was performed in stages over 49 days in a specially consecrated courtyard. The purpose of the dance was to integrate humanity with the cosmos, a fundamental Taoist concern, by calling to earth the gods who live in each of the Dipper's 7 stars. The stars were perfect worlds, and it was improbable that the gods would have voluntarily left their spheres to come to the human world. But the priests, by performing the dances and chanting invocations, could summon them, and the gods came to bestow blessings and provide divine aid. Only with the gods themselves present could the festival truly have spiritual power. The priests fasted for 7 days in order to purify themselves. They erected 3 poles and an altar before the main temple hall. Incense burners, red candles, flowers, oil lamps, and offerings were placed on the altar, and a large circle inscribed around it. With the circumference of this circle were marked 7 spots in the shape of the Big Dipper. Only then was the temple ready to receive the gods. On the day Sai-Hung went to see the ceremony, he saw the abbot emerge from the temple in elaborate robes. Most of the priests who had been wandering in the festival dressed in worn, threadbare robes covered with patches, but the high priest was immaculately groomed. His long hair was put up beneath a black cloth hat, and he wore a robe embroidered with the yin-yang symbols and the hexagrams from the I Ching. The wind-catcher sleeves were so long that they hid his hands. He carried a datewood plaque inscribed with his own personal incantation and a willow wood sword. Walking gracefully on black velvet shoes with 4-inch thick soles, he performed devotions at the altar before stepping into the sacred circle. Surrounding the perimeter of the circle, the pilgrims pressed in closely to view the dance, one of martial movements and swordplay. The abbot stood in turn on each of the spots that represented the stars, holding the plaque before his face. Because mortals were unworthy to gaze at the gods, he chanted long invocations and called each god by name. Sai-Hung thought the dance looked like great fun. He dashed into the sacred circle and ran behind the abbot to imitate his rhythm and twisting steps. A murmur went up among the assembled devotees. Would you like to see Guan Sai-Hung? A year or so from when I read the book, I got this phone call at work from this guy with a Eastern European accent who said he was a student of Greg Fong, who wanted to know if I was interested in taking a workshop with Guan Sai-Hung, because he had a connection that with him in San Francisco, and they were willing to bring him up and do a workshop in Portland. And I said, absolutely, for sure, I'm down.
Who was it? Was it Alex?
It was Alex. It was my first contact with Alex.
Are you serious?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
It fell through. It didn't happen, you know, but he reminded me of it when I met him again in '97 when he went to China with it.
Did Alex actually meet him?
No, he just talked to some secretary or something, some intermediary of his in San Francisco that was willing to set it up. Of course, now it's a different world. You just Google Guan Sai-Hung and see what comes up. And one of the things that comes up, of course, is this whole long discussion page of what phony bullshit Guan Sai-Hung is, and all of these people who knew him and knew that, oh, he wrote it all himself. You know, his name was Frank. You know, he wasn't even from China. It's complete bullshit. And then other people who say, oh, the guy who's the actual author, Dong Ming Dao, I know him. He's a real guy. And he's a writer and an artist. Lives in San Francisco. And so you get, you know, this, all these different, and he did study with this guy named Guan Sai-Hung. And so you put in Dong Ming Dao and you get his website, and he is a real guy, and he's an artist and a writer, and he wrote all these books, and he studied with Guan Sai-Hung for 13 years. Now, whether or not Guan Sai-Hung is actually in his 90s now and was 60 back in the 80s when he looked 30, that's another question. Or, you know, whether any of these stories were things he actually experienced, to me, highly unlikely. But that scene was real. That's the way China was in the 20s. What he was recording was something that actually happened in the way Chinese religion worked. And I think very, very significant that I'm starting to realize that there were these big festivals which looked to us just like kind of craziness, in which they really were doing magical ceremonies to connect with their gods and try to balance the universe, and that was a real thing. Now, if it was a story some teacher told him, or whether he's now 95 years old, is I think, a good and legitimate question, and I think that's bullshit. But the stories that he tells, I think, are basically true about what China was like at that time, and kind of well written. But then, of course, you put in Guan Sai Hong.
Let's see him.
2012.
2012.
2012.
Is that supposed to be him?
That's him.
At what, like 95 or something?
Yeah.
Oh, what a fun guy.
What's that? Now, I think it's bullshit that he's 93, but if he's 65, he's better than I am.
His body type matches the description.
Maybe it's 93.
What's that?
He could be 93. I doubt it too, but crazy things have happened.
When is this video from?
Right, 2012.
He almost doesn't even look Chinese.
What's that?
He almost doesn't even look Chinese.
It's questionable whether he's Chinese. The name on his passport is Frank, somebody said on the angry website. And it's not a Chinese passport.
How did they know?
What passport is it?
I can't remember, maybe Malaysian or something.
Oh. There's a lot of Chinese people in Malaysia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Who knows how he got the passport?
or how he got the identity that he uses.
I like that face.
Anybody can stand there, let's move along.
What about that woman that came from far? How old was she? The older
Which
woman?
one? Oh, the one that was just there?
Yeah,
The women's one.
yeah.
She was in her late 70s.
She didn't strike me, like the way she moved didn't strike me as that old.
Yeah, she
In a
definitely.
sense, she really,
Annette.
yeah.
Maybe early 80s.
This is pretty good for in your 60s.
But he could do magical things in the book.
Oh, yeah.
It's reminding me of Zoom Zoom.
Really? Of the people standing on the side with their phones, like.
It's like these guys have never done this before.
Yeah, not a lot of
Yeah,
advanced-
it's still,
not a lot
I
of
mean,
advanced
if you
students
judge a
anyway.
guy by his students, they're students of shit.
Yeah.
Oh, it could be a
Oh, it's a
workshop.
workshop.
Could be, you know, new people.
They're in New York City.
Yeah, a weekend.
Yeah, he doesn't live in
It's a
New York,
weekend
you know that.
workshop. Okay. You're right, it's a weekend workshop. Don't judge the teacher by the students.
Imagine that the toxic area because all the way up to town is a colony.
Oh, that looks like a familiar size head to body ratio.
Whoever comes on the microphone.
What's that? Very possibly full of shit. But I thought he had kung fu for a guy in his 60s.
There's a couple probably took artistic license in it. You know?
Well, and in fact, that's traditional. I really think that most of what Kung Fu history is out there is people trying to inspire their students, often from an oral tradition in which that doesn't matter so much of when exactly things happen or who they happen to. What you're trying to do is trying to get your students to practice. How do you get them practice? You tell them inspiring stories about mystery and magic.
What could happen?
And what can happen, and try to give them a sense of the magical, and that their teacher is somebody extraordinarily special whom they shouldn't bother to look for anybody else. I think that's traditional, and that's the way it's always been done, and his teacher taught him that way, and that's the way he learned. But it's nice that there is this other Western, very analytical, very interested in historical facts, very much trying to determine the truth. I really like that as well. And this book is actually really quite wonderful for that. This is a French lady anthropologist that went to a Taoist temple in Shandong and hung out, and this is like recently, hung out and tried to figure out what exactly they were doing and teaching and what made a Taoist master and how the whole thing worked. And it's really, from my perspective, quite interesting because they are Longmen Guanjin Taoists. That's what Li Dao was, Wang's teacher. You can get an idea by how she describes their world, the world that he lived in. Now, there's not a mention in here of Kung Fu, because primarily people in monasteries don't do Kung Fu. But in fact, Li Dao did, and it has been a part and in both Taoism and Buddhism in China long time back. But to try to determine where and how this came in, I think some kind of understanding of the way Guanjin Taoism actually worked and what they consider a Taoist master to be is significant. If you want to be a Taoist, from their perspective, people come and to festivals like this to have fun and to do rituals, and that's for ordinary people. If you're going to be a Taoist, you have to give up sex, meat, alcohol, just like the Buddhists do. This came into Guanjin Taoism long time ago, and this is very part of it. And if you want to leave your family, which is taboo, first of all, in China, and usually only orphans or outcasts do it, or people who have some kind of special calling. If you want to leave your family, it is possible to become a Taoist monastic. You go and you live in the monastery just to see how you like it for minimum 3 years, where you take part in the rituals, you learn the precepts, the rules. You don't get a hat, but you grow your hair long, and you start to wear a top knot, and you become part of the monastery. And at a certain point then, to be admitted among the Taoist masters, one must be formally invested by a Taoist master. One's future apprenticeship father will bestow the Taoist cap, a new religious name, and the canonical texts, as well as a certificate of ordination and several emblematic objects of the monastic life. This occurs in one of the most symbolic, or at least the most visible steps of entering the religion, the ordination ceremony known as the rite of the cap and gown, often called minor consecration or consecration of the cap and gown. It's a regular become a priest. Then you enter into an apprenticeship. After ordination, the new Taoist becomes a full apprentice in the monastery. His entry into the Taoist lineage gives him the right to partake of all its secrets while demanding his active engagement with prevailing rules. The monastics explain that they have their own method of transmission. They call themselves pupils or students and say that they are studying, but their methods of learning are quite different from those of the ordinary Chinese school system. Beyond the specific framework of the Taoist Academy in Beijing and its provincial annexes on Mount Qingcheng and Nanyu, the formation of Taoist monasteries is difficult to analyze. Nor is it, as far as I know, the subject of any written charter. Instead, it depends on the relationship between master and disciple and is the function of individual personalities. Nevertheless, fieldwork has shown that Taoist apprenticeships tend to conform to certain basic criteria. They operate strictly in binary relations, such as master and disciple or senior or junior student, literally, quote, among four ears. As Yuan Jun explained to his lay disciple, Mr. Peng, the Taoist religion talks about individual transmission, Dan Chuan, because the Tao cannot propagate itself between 6 ears, but only between 4, i.e. between 2 people. At the same time, teaching ideally occurs in a non-discursive way, through imitation, repetition, gifts of books, and so on. It would also work through the dialectic of questioning and confidence, notably when it comes to exchanging recipes communicated only orally from generation to generation. The apprenticeship, therefore, is long, slow, and progressive. Taoism, being the teaching without words, is a recurrent theme in the classics. Taoist teaching lineages do not transmit all knowledge in books. For example, Wengong monastics relate how 2 colleagues came from Guan to teach them how to consecrate a sacred area, which essentially meant that they participated in the inauguration ritual of the Doumu Dian on Mount Tiantai, giving the locals the chance to observe and learn from actual practice. This makes it clear that in Taoist apprenticeship there cannot be a firm schedule of daily study with the master, a set program, or a definite evaluation of progress. Whatever the master says to his disciples concerns only the 2 of them. The time of the ritual services centers around the recitation of the canonical scriptures and occasional rituals. Besides this, the monastics take care of various necessary domestic tasks, often a good occasion for a disciple to learn from the master. He observes him in his ritual activities as well as in his ordinary daily behavior. The rest of the time, he pursues his study through individual practice as well as through reading, repetition, and copying. What the monastic does during his free time, which really is most of the time, is entirely up to him. Nobody is judged by others a priori. The transmission method means that it is for the master to guide his disciple. He usually does it in a rather unpredictable manner, step by step, according to the unique ability and the progress of each disciple. This is because having too educational attitude toward the disciple will influence him in a preconceived way and prevent him from listening to his intuition and from experiencing the Taoist perspective for himself. The relation between master and disciple resembles that of the father and son in several respects. The father teaches all he knows to his son, just as the master transmits all his knowledge to the disciple. The son obeys his father, while the disciple does what the master tells him to do. The one may add that the disciple remains indebted to his ordination master all his life, just as the son can never fully discharge the obligation of his father. However, once he has obtained the master's expertise, in part or entirety, the disciple, unlike the son, may leave to establish other apprenticeship relations and obtain multiple spiritual fathers. When Bai Li Zhuan says that the apprenticeship is not regulated, he means that everyone has to find his own way. that each monastic has to learn on his own, learning by themselves from various masters. Taoist apprentices may well be considered self-taught, yet they also work with various masters and thus receive formal transmission. The master speaking little, the disciple finding his way on his own, may sound hard, but it also renders it possible for each person to select his or her own aspects of the teaching, depending on what is important to the individual and the variety of teachings he or she receives. All progress on the quest, then, is due to personal observations, practice, and perseverance. Apprenticeship is progressive, but because it takes so long, because advice is rare, and because the student must be well versed in both doctrines and practices, assiduousness and stubbornness are essential. It is, therefore, a matter of an apprenticeship by clearing one's own way. I like that. That sounds familiar. That makes sense to me. And that is, in fact, the kind of relationship that Wang had with Li Dao, and, in fact, the kind of training Li Dao had as well. And it explains in there that, like, what's cool about their system is once that you reach a certain level, you can go anywhere you want. You can go all over China and get free room and board in any Taoist monastery you show up in, just by reciting the line of poetry that your monastery has for your generation. In other words, you've got a password that are recognized among the monastics. So just not everybody can walk into a monastery and be taken care of. But at a certain time, you can go all over and study with whoever you want. And in fact, the older, wiser masters show up at a monastery, and flocks of people come to them, so they go to remoter and remoter places, which is exactly the way Wang describes Li Dao as being. And talk about guys like that are still alive. They may not know the stuff that Li Dao did, but the form is the same. The same system that he worked within still exists, where basically you make an individual relationship with an individual student, and what passes between you is strictly between you. So really, it's hard to know what any of those guys know, because they're not. It's not necessarily part of the ordinary Taoist doctrine, and could could have been buried within a particular line of teaching for who knows how long, and survive within this context of this particular method of transmission. We could see the eventual what happened to the big swords. Do you remember the big swords? Mm-hmm. The big swords, of course, backed the boxers and got crushed, hunted down, and run out of Shandong. But they went up into Manchuria, and in Manchuria they were encouraged and supported to a degree, and formed the first voluntary militia that fought against the Japanese when the Japanese came in and took over Manchuria, and so became legendary heroes even up into, in 1963, during the Cultural Revolution, there was a ballet made of the big swords, the big sword, the Da Dao March, 1963.
Very patriotic.
Is that death to foreigners, death to Japanese?
They call them foreign demons,
Right.
basically.
So who are we rooting for here?
What's that?
Who are we rooting for?
The one with the sword.
What?
Can't tell Chinese from Japanese?
I wish all fighting scenes were still like this. Yeah, and I wouldn't have to look away. I know. You're like, oh, beautiful dancing. Exactly.
Look at that.
Like that arabesque. The toe is pointed.
Before you all get your thumbs on
I mean, we get the point.
Oh, here's the climax!
Oh.
The girl with the big sword!
Is she a red lantern?
Yeah.
See? Like, no blood.
So they survived and prospered. Until, of course, they abolished all heterodox sex. Repressed them again.
That's great. So, is there any living transmission that you have found?
Yes.
Besides,
Li Dao.
Yes, besides Li Dao, I mean, is there like a separate community or something that
Of-
managed to?
No, I don't. Not that I found. That call themselves big swords still, or
Or have inherited whatever inner tradition?
I see it in pretty much all the systems that you look at. They'll have some form of what they call the. You look for the name iron. If there's iron in a form, usually it involves this intense, compressed Dantian breathing and stretching and pulling on the tendons, and oftentimes beating as well. But I think pieces of it survived in most of the Kung Fu systems that survived. But it's interesting that, like say Nick's school, you go to the website of his father and there's the legendary history which talks of somebody living in Xi'an, a shepherd boy living in Xinjiang, which is like way eastern Tibet, where Chinese have occupied it for centuries, but there are not many of them there. It's basically Uyghurs, But a shepherd boy seeing a Taoist or a Buddhist monk and following him up to a monastery and being on his knees for days before being allowed into the monastery and teaching the secret teaching, Yeah, but then you go online and you see one of his old students say, he never talked about that stuff before the 90s. In reality, he was part of he had a rich father who got him good teachers, in the 30s. So then he became a Kung Fu instructor for the Guomingdong, and that's something.
This is what people are saying about Nick's.
This is Nick's lineage,
Right.
That it doesn't really go back further than this guy who's essentially Li Jiao's. It's like Nick's father studied with a guy who studied with a guy, and that guy was trained in traditional China with old teachers, and then trained actually taught in the military academy for the nationalist Chinese, then went to Taiwan and started a martial arts school, essentially.
What's that guy name?
What's that?
What's his name? Huang.
Guan, yeah, Guan. And then eventually gave the name of Taishan to the school. And it's a big school. But talking about being the 68th generation from back in the Ming Dynasty, no, it's total bullshit. They can't, I mean, yeah, the practices go back that far, but the school itself usually was started by some guy who was trained in the 20s, who managed to get to Taiwan or some other place and started Kung Fu school. Take a sweep of the room.
No, I do.
Show everybody that's here.
I realize I have
Start with
about
Ben.
4 weeks of discipline in me.
Don't forget Max. Down here, he's completely
Yeah.
under the chair.
There's Max's feet.
You got your feet.
85, 90%. That's great. But I'm getting tired of it. Sure, that year I went out and
My naturopath told me I did a liver cleanse and I wanted to do it longer. And he said, go ahead as long as you feel okay. But
once
if
you're,
you feel like it's also hard, like you may have been.
this is definitely a gentle.
Everyone?
than what I did.
Did you get yourself?
But in a sense,